Have you ever heard of a company that survived over a century of America's biggest economic woes, and still most people have no idea it ever existed? For 124 years, this company survived Jim Crow, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and decades of pressure from competitors with far deeper pockets. This was the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, one of the most influential African-American businesses in U.S. history. Join us as we explore the century-long victories, battles, and triumphs of Durham's Black Wall Street. The attack that sparked an empire. Unlike most others, the story of this business empire doesn't trace back to a boardroom, but to a fire. On November 10, 1898, an angry mob of 2,000 armed men marched into Wilmington, North Carolina, and burned the city's only African-American newspaper to the ground. They moved through the Brooklyn neighborhood, destroying every store and home belonging to African-American families. They forced the elected city government to resign at gunpoint and drove thousands of residents out of their communities permanently. As many as 60 people lost their lives that day. Yet that was just the beginning. To justify the attack, many supporters at the time called it a response to hidden criminal activity. But a closer look at the timing, the organization, and the succession of targets tells a different story. This was not a riot. It was a carefully planned coup. It was the only successful overthrow of a fairly elected government in American history. Its targets were specifically the political and business class that had spent 30 years building something big in North Carolina. The men and women who ran for office, wrote for the newspapers, and created the economic foundation that made everyday life possible for African Americans living in the South. Now, the survivors had a decision to make. Would they keep working on the business that could give Black Americans better access to life insurance and health care? Or would they simply give up out of fear? 2 weeks before Wilmington burned, 7 African-American men in Durham had quietly incorporated something called the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association. The following spring, they opened for business in a single rented office and hired agents to walk through African-American neighborhoods, collecting small premiums from families who had nowhere else to turn. No established insurance company in the country was willing to cover an African-American family at a fair price. The goal these 7 men set was simple. When someone died, there would be enough money to bury them with dignity, and enough left to take care of whomever they left behind. At the end of that first month, after paying their agents their commissions, all the company had collected was $1.12. A very small amount, no question. But from that number, 1 rented office and 7 men with no outside investors and no institutional backing, North Carolina Mutual would go on to become the largest business owned by African Americans on Earth. And it would take well over a century for the world to finally bring it down. Yet the many victories the company achieved in those 100 years are where this story really begins. The men who built from nothing. 2 years after the Wilmington massacre, the company those 7 men had incorporated was still standing, but barely. Out of fear, almost nobody was willing to align themselves with the original vision of the insurance company. So Charles Clinton Spaulding, one of the 7 who started it, took the job of general manager on his own in 1900. He went door to door himself since no agent was brave enough to show up. Every policy, payment, and claim was tracked by hand, and when the few agents who showed up quit, he covered their routes without reducing operations. As time went by, collections went short with little time to generate income, and that was when his 2 partners stepped in. The first was John Merrick, the man who made up for the losses, and the next was Dr. Aaron Moore, who brought in policyholders through his medical practice. Through his experience, he was able to sit with families in their homes and sign them up directly. Though it seemed the company was off to a good start, it did not turn a profit for 3 full years. But by 1905, NC Mutual had outgrown its first office and opened additional locations across North Carolina. By 1910, it had crossed state lines with dozens of locations in states far away. And even in 1914, when the First World War started and the future was looking grim, many more families were showed interest in life insurance. So in the midst of this, NC Mutual's life insurance in force grew from $5 million to $26 million, driven in part by a sudden increase in cotton prices that brought greater prosperity to Southern African American families. By 1915, agents were working across the South, carrying policies into Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, and Maryland. Each new state brought in new agents, new offices, and new families. Yet that wasn't all the company was up to. At the time, NC Mutual had opened Lincoln Hospital in Durham. Then Mechanics and Farmers Bank opened its doors on Parrish Street. The National Religious Training School followed, and then the Stanford Warren Library. NC Mutual's capital and its founders' networks were behind every single one of them. Sadly, not all the founders would see how far things went. John Merrick passed away in 1906, and Aaron Moore died in 1923. Spalding was left to carry it alone. Under his watch, NC Mutual moved into a new 6-story headquarters on Parrish Street in Durham, funded entirely without outside loans or external investors. 200 employees reported to work inside it every morning. Parrish Street now had a bank, law firms, real estate offices, and a newspaper. All part of what had become the most concentrated stretch of African-American business in the country. And then came the disaster of 1929. When the Great Depression hit America and the stock market crashed, it took down companies across every industry. NC Mutual's insurance in force dropped from $39 million to $33 million. What stopped it from collapsing entirely were its investments in real estate, government bonds, and mortgage loans. This strategy turned out to be one of the smartest financial decisions in the company's history, and after that period, the company continued to expand. By 1939, the Second World War had begun, and NC Mutual invested $4.4 million in U.S. government bonds. By 1945, the company declared a dividend to policyholders from a $1 million surplus, marking the first time in its history that it had ever paid money back to the families who trusted it. When the war ended that same year, NC Mutual was trusted enough to write group insurance policies for Ford Motor Company. But tragedy struck on August 1, 1952. Charles Spalding passed away in Durham. He had run the company for over 50 years. At the time of his passing, NC Mutual had over $200 million of insurance in force, assets exceeding $40 million, and district offices across 13 states with agents working in 44 locations and 26 branch offices. Few companies in American history, black or white, had been so defined by one person for so long. To keep things going, his nephew Asa Spalding took over. He was the first African American in United States history to pass the actuarial examination, qualifying in 1933, and had worked inside NC Mutual for decades before taking the top position. He continued expanding the company's reach through the 50s and well into the 60s. During the Civil Rights Movement, NC Mutual's offices on Parrish Street became a meeting point for organizers and community leaders in Durham. Asa Spalding was one of 2 African Americans appointed by Durham's mayor to negotiate directly with student sit-in leaders during the city's civil rights demonstrations. The company donated to civil rights organizations and provided institutional backing to the movement while continuing to operate as a private business. In an era when most corporate employers in the South had not yet desegregated their own workforces, NC Mutual had employed over 3,000 African American agents, clerks, actuaries, and administrators. And the expansion only grew from there. In 1971, NC Mutual became the first company managed by African Americans in history to put $1 billion of insurance in force. By 1976, the company had expanded into 24 states and the District of Columbia. Assets had grown to over $210 million. The surplus stood at $26 million, and total insurance in force was well over $1 billion. 855,000 families across over a dozen states were covered. It seemed nothing could take this company down. But then, at a time no one expected, the very same victories that had made NC Mutual great would begin to work against it. This is how it happened. The civil rights victories and consequences. Many today find it ironic that the one factor that caused the company's collapse was the very same thing it spent millions to make possible. For years, NC Mutual had always stood for supporting racial minorities by granting access to affordable insurance and healthcare. So when the civil rights legislation was passed in the 1960s and mainstream insurers were finally forced to open their doors to African American customers, those same customers quickly forgot about the company that made it possible. And slowly but surely, NC Mutual would lose supporters and customers until it became a shadow of its old self. There were many reasons for this struggle. For one, mainstream firms still had more access to capital built up over generations of advantage. And seeing they had lots of African Americans unsatisfied with what NC had offered for decades without innovation, these mainstream companies introduced new products based on the feedback NC Mutual had allegedly been ignoring for a long time. To many, it seemed NC Mutual had forgotten what made them chosen and preferred in the first place. And mainstream competitors took advantage of this by studying the minor insurance market. Yiwu took on the things they lacked, what most customers complained about, and the many ways they could make up for it without losing any of the things that made NC Mutual special. They perfected the business model and marketed heavily to these communities and offered bonuses for many cases that charged higher. At much fairer prices, terms, and product range, NC Mutual couldn't keep up, and customers moved without thinking twice. 50 years ago, the door had opened in one direction only, but now, thanks to the civil rights movement the company funded and supported, African American families now had more options than they had ever had before. Knowing the much lesser benefits in NC and other insurance companies like it, white customers did not return the favor. They stayed exactly where they had always been, causing the number of people still paying NC to start dwindling. On the surface, NC Mutual was still very successful, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. By 1978, premiums for mainstream companies grew by 12%, while those for NC and other African American firms offering insurance fell by 5% on average. By 1989, 11 African American insurance companies were either merged or absorbed by mainstream groups. Still, the company wasn't done yet. To garner more influence, NC Mutual hired more agents, expanded its product line, and tried as hard as it could to compete. On paper, these were all the right moves to make, and there were many victories in the short term. But there were significant problems they'd have to deal with. First off, many fewer investors and companies were willing to put in the money needed for the firm to stay afloat in the long term, so NC Mutual could not sustain the new and expanded business model. Also, one former employee who arrived at the company at the time recalled there being around 70 insurance companies owned by African Americans that were still in operation. 5 years later, there were 35. Then that number dropped to 30 in a few months, and then it fell to 20 by the following year. They folded one after another because the customers were gone and the capital to compete for new ones was never there to begin with. But even then, the company still had many things going for it. By December 1999, at the turn of the millennium, NC Mutual still had $77 million in revenue and 258 employees, and it was still the largest African American insurance company in the country. But fast forward to 2015, and we have the company desperately taking risks that would ultimately bury the business for good. What they did was unbelievable. That year, despite several warnings from public financial analysts and commentators, NC Mutual moved $34 million in assets into a reinsurance arrangement. The investment manager responsible for those assets was a man named Bradley Reifler. He was 61 years old and based in Millbrook, New York. NC had just handed over a huge chunk of its money to this man, and his reputation at this point was not good. Still, he was the only one offering the deal NC desperately needed at this point, so it seemed the higher-ups at NC Mutual had no other choice. It didn't take long for those warnings to take effect. The man in charge of the fortune was as unreliable as everyone warned, and in just a few months, rather than investing the money according to the terms of the agreement, Bradley Reifler secretly put it into his private account and invested into self-serving ventures for his own personal and business use. When an audit in 2016 raised concerns about his bad spending habits, he submitted fake documents and directed others who benefited with him to do the same. For 5 years, the fraud continued until it could no longer be hidden. What happened next in December 2020 forever sealed the company's fate. When news broke about Bradley's corruption, federal prosecutors quickly got involved, and they charged Bradley Reifler with wire fraud and perjury. The indictment stated that he had stolen more than $34 million belonging to NC Mutual. This happened after he had claimed under oath in response to a civil suit that all his investments had been legally approved. In 2021, he signed a plea agreement, pleading guilty to 1 count of wire fraud, and the judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. NC Mutual was now in deep water. They filed lawsuits against 5 corporate defendants for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. And though the company won all 5 cases, it recovered almost nothing in return to justify the effort. Back in December 2018, 3 years after selling off to Bradley, the North Carolina Department of Insurance had placed NC Mutual into rehabilitation. At this point, the company stopped writing new policies entirely, and 4 years of attempted recovery followed. None of it worked. All efforts to keep it going didn't work, and on October 11, 2022, after over a century of business, the Superior Court of Wake County approved a petition to liquidate NC Mutual Life Insurance Company. The liquidation process took effect on October 31, 2022. And the time of liquidation, it was informed that the costs far outweighed all assets by $78 million. The company still had 240,000 policyholders across 48 states when the court order came through. And just like that, 126 years of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears seemed to be completely gone in an instant. However, that wasn't the end of the story, as it left a legacy no African-American company has rivaled, even to this day. How it closed gracefully. The North Carolina Insurance Commissioner Mike Causey explained what happened plainly in a statement. NC Mutual had weathered countless storms for over 120 years, but ultimately closed down due to Bradley Reifler's fraud. His crimes left the company in dire financial condition and proved to be the death knell for NC Mutual. The company lost $34 million to a man who was later convicted of federal wire fraud and sent to prison for 5 years. No government loan came after this, and no federal restructuring or bailout. The North Carolina Insurance Guarantee Association covered the existing policyholders as required by state law, but the rest was liquidated. The 6-story building on Parrish Street in Durham still stands. The NC Mutual name is still on it, but inside the offices are empty. The street it sits on, once called the Wall Street of Black America, is now lined with restaurants, apartments, and coffee shops built for the new residents moving into a neighborhood built by African-American families over a century. These families no longer live in these homes, and the many victories associated with that region are long forgotten today. NC Mutual was not a company that quietly faded away. Rather, it was a company that fought on every front for over a century and yet kept winning long after most businesses would have stopped trying. When the stock market crashed in October 1929 and took the entire American economy down with it, NC Mutual held its ground. Many companies did not survive this shift. Among them were Victory and National Benefit Life Insurance, both of which had been founded in 1898 by Samuel Rutherford. They both failed during the Depression era. Standard Life Insurance Company, founded in 1913 by famous African-American businessman Herman Perry, had an explosive beginning with over $22 million in force by 1922. But Perry expanded into real estate, printing, pharmaceuticals, and construction, which drained cash reserves and forced a sale to a white-owned company in 1924. Yet $39 million in insurance force just before the crash, the NC Mutual never dropped $33 million at all through the entire Great Depression. This was the deliberate result of years of smart, careful investing in government bonds and mortgage loans that protected the company when everything around it was falling apart. Yet that was just the start of many victories it's remembered for. After the Great Depression came World War II, and NC Mutual did not just survive it, it grew through it. Insurance in force climbed from $51 million when the war started to over $100 million by the time it ended. For the first time in the company's history, it paid dividends directly to its policyholders. A company that had started with $1.12 was now writing checks back to the families who had trusted it with their money. By 1971, it had crossed $1 billion in insurance in force. By the early 90s, that number had grown tenfold from where it stood in the early 70s, making NC Mutual the largest African-American insurance company in the country for nearly the entire 20th century. In 2000, with integration having already pulled millions of customers toward mainstream competitors, NC Mutual still had $77.3 million in revenue and 258 employees, still holding the title of the biggest African-American insurance business in the United States. This was a company that survived Jim Crow, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights era, and decades of market pressure from competitors with far deeper pockets. Every single one of those things should have been enough to end it. None of them did. What ended it was $34 million, stolen by one man, Bradley Reifler, who was later convicted of federal wire fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. NC Mutual filed lawsuits, fought back in court, and won. It recovered almost nothing. The loss was too large and the reserves too thin after a century of carrying more than any company should ever have to carry alone. The company lasted 123 years out of just $1.12 at the start to over $1 billion in today's money. Despite its closure, the sacrifices made by NC Mutual left a foundation that still stands today. Mechanics and Farmers Bank, which NC Mutual helped seed, is still operating in Durham and has served African American families for over a century. Lincoln Hospital served generations of patients who had nowhere else to turn. The Stanford Warren Library still stands as a community resource. The 6-story headquarters on Parrish Street is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and the model NC Mutual proved that African American institutions could build billion-dollar enterprises from nothing, influenced every Black-owned business that came after it, and continues to do so today. Ultimately, NC Mutual did not fail, but was robbed. Yet it still outlasted almost everything that ever tried to stop it along the way. After over a century of success and thriving both within and beyond the Black community, the company may have ended, but it ended gracefully. Now tell us what you think in the comments down below. Did you know about this company? Have you heard about it? What better decisions could have been made when it was at its peak? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.